All right, let's catch up now with Sherwin Bryce Pease, who's standing by for us in Washington. Sherwin, so a triumphant return for the finance minister. How's it looking for him a day in?
Well, he's about to walk into a G20 finance ministers meeting here at the IMF World Bank meetings, and of course chairing the BRICS African ministers meeting yesterday, also chairing the SADC ministers meeting. So he feels that he's hitting the road running. Certainly to be chairing after being absent, all these fora after being absent for so many years, I think is a feather certainly in his cap, and certainly not unfamiliar territory for this finance minister. Francis, we are due to speak to the finance minister after he steps out of that G20 finance ministers meeting at around 17:35 your time. So that's pretty much just ahead of your primetime business slot tonight. So something to look forward to, certainly.
All right, we do look forward to that in prime time. Sherwin, you've outlaid the things that are topping the agenda: structural reform, debt, which is something that affects South Africa deeply. What does this all mean for us as a country?
Well, let's use South Africa as the example, right? The South African debt to GDP ratio is at above 50%. Of course, this is a huge concern. If you talk about a country like the United States, it's over 100%. And whether you were talking to the IMF Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, yesterday, or the World Bank President, Jim Yong Kim, both these two global economics leaders talking about the need for countries to really focus on debt. In fact, an African colleague of mine stood up in the press conference with the World Bank President and asked him, if there were no journalists in the room and you were just in a room with finance ministers or government officials, what would you tell them? And he said, deal with the debt. And of course, as you heard also in that soundbite, the need for African countries to really upscale their investments in human capital. There is a huge concern throughout Africa that as economies are becoming more digitalized, as technology is taking over so many jobs, our workforce is not going to be fit for purpose for a future global economy. Another issue, Francis, which I think will be interesting to certainly yourself and many South Africans, is talk about cryptocurrencies here. And what we are beginning to see happen here among policymakers is talk about greater supervision, greater regulation. There are over 100 cryptocurrencies in the world today. You know, people like to talk about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just one of over 100. And you're seeing a greater emphasis here. There's concern about the volatility of these currencies. There's a greater a desire for stability in terms of these cryptocurrencies and greater understanding about how they actually work. So in the future moving forward, expect more conversations, certainly from the South African Reserve Bank, about how they regulate cryptocurrencies in terms of the broader economy.
Well, talking about the Reserve Bank, the governor is there. Have you seen him in the corridors, Sherwin?
I have seen him in the corridors in passing, Francis. He is due to speak to us after this G20 meeting. He's also due to speak to us after our conversation with the finance minister. That's going to be at around 6 p.m. South African time. So there's lots we want to talk to him about. I mean, we saw the consumer inflation numbers come in at below expectation today. People immediately then talk about, if inflation's doing so well, are we going to see another repo rate cut come the next monetary policy committee meeting in May? He's going to wag his finger at me when I ask him that question, because he doesn't like to talk about what they're going to do in the future, but we'll certainly see what he has to say. Certainly the sentiment here is positive. I saw him in a discussion with Bloomberg yesterday, and he spoke about how reforms are underway. We are in an era of institutional reform in South Africa, particularly when you talk about changes we are seeing in the various state-owned enterprises. I must also add, Francis, that Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan is in town. He has a very important meeting that I want to flag here with the World Bank. They are going to discuss the $3.7 billion loan that was awarded to Eskom for the Medupi power station in Limpopo in 2010. There have been a number of concerns about that loan. There was speculation that the World Bank might recall the loan as early as January this year. So we are very interested to hear what that discussion is about, what he's come to town to talk about, and whether in fact the World Bank is considering recalling that loan, particularly over corruption concerns within Eskom. But of course we've seen a new board being established. There is a new chief in town, and his name is Pravin Gordhan, so we want to hear what he has to say.
Very important for Eskom that's struggling to pay for coal. Sherwin, finally, she doesn't wag her finger, but the IMF chief always seems to allude to the US President Donald Trump and his protectionist policies. She was speaking yesterday about how the world would be better off if everyone worked together. Is this a meeting that can bring countries closer when there are those isolationist tendencies, particularly in the US right now?
It's an excellent question, and this is obviously something that came up in that engagement with Christine Lagarde yesterday. And she was asked specifically, if you were to pick a winner in a possible trade war, remember we're not in a trade war yet, there's talk about tariff increases on aluminium and steel, particularly affecting the relationship between China and the United States. And of course there have been reciprocal war of words in terms of how the Chinese, how Beijing will respond. And the question to Christine Lagarde was, who do you think is going to win this war? And her response was quite informative. She said the IMF is not in the business of picking casualties. We are here to create a platform for increased dialogue, but also talked about unilateral actions that will hurt the collective. I mean, we saw when the US economy tanked in 2007, it affected everybody. So anything that happens anywhere, particularly when you're talking about the two elephants playing on the grass, they affect everyone around them. So she did talk about the fact that this is a place where we encourage dialogue, we create this platform to encourage engagement, but very clear, Francis, that increased trade over the decades has reduced poverty. It has realized in part the Millennium Development Goals, and it is critical to achieving the SDGs come 2030. So quite unequivocal that protectionist policies, particularly taken on a unilateral basis, is not good for the global economy.
All right, thank you very much. Sherwin Bryce Pease in Washington, D.C. for us, and he will be speaking to all our top financial officials who are on the ground there at the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. We take a short